On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event on Can Transit Infrastructure be delivered better? Can transit infrastructure projects be delivered better? With Eric Goldwyn from NYU's Marron Institute of Urban Management. I would also like to welcome those of you who are joining us virtually through our live stream. We have at least as many people on the live stream as in the room today. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the School of Cities here at the University of Toronto. This event today is being co-sponsored by IMFG and the Infrastructure Institute at the School of Cities. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. First, as always, some thank yous. I'd like to thank IMFG's external funders, Havana Capital, Maitrey, the City of Toronto, and the regions of Halton, Peel, York, and Durham. I'd also like to thank our staff at IMFG, Shanali Chakraborty and Piali Roy, and Adam and the team here at Monk for all their help in organizing the event and for making it run smoothly, and I know it will run smoothly. If you are posting comments on LinkedIn or other social media platforms, our hashtag is IMFG Talks. So the topic of transit infrastructure, and in particular, how much it costs to build large projects, is certainly a timely one. We hear about it in the media regularly, in the newspapers, in social media. Can transit infrastructure projects be delivered on time and on budget? Canadians, all of us here, have certainly become a bit skeptical, given the many examples of delayed projects and cost overruns. Our speaker today is going to unpack some of the reasons for the high costs and delays and share some solutions, or at least some better approaches from other countries. So the rest of my role today is to introduce our moderator, who will introduce our speaker to you. Our moderator is Maddie Simioticki. I think Maddie is known to most of you. He's the director of the Infrastructure Institute, which, like IMFG, is an affiliate institute at the School of Cities. He is also a professor of geography and planning at U of T. And Maddie works on how to deliver large-scale infrastructure projects, evidence-based infrastructure investment decisions, and the effective integration of infrastructure into the fabric of cities. He is known to many of you, as I said, as a frequent media commentator on infrastructure and city planning. So please welcome Maddie Simioticki.
Thank you, Enid. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start out by thanking Enid for co-sponsoring this event with the Infrastructure Institute today. Looking out at this room, seeing many familiar faces, part of me wishes we weren't here at all. That we understood how to build projects effectively, that we were doing it well every day, that projects were built affordably, quickly, with minimal disruption, that we didn't debate them endlessly, relitigate our decisions, and then relitigate them again. But here we are. And so it really is, given the situation that we're in, this conversation couldn't be more timely. I spent the afternoon reading some of the work that Eric has put together, and I'll introduce Eric in just a minute. And one of the stats that jumped out at me, in the United States bipartisan infrastructure bill, they're allocating about $100 billion to public transit for the entire United States. Recent research looking at the GTA suggests that we're spending $80 billion. This region is spending nearly the same amount as the entire country of the United States of America, 340 some odd million people. So this is the scale of what we're doing. And at the same time, we are among the highest cost jurisdictions to build in. Again, research by Eric and some of his colleagues shows we are in the top 10 most expensive places to build public transit. That is not a great place to be. We're spending a lot of money, we're catching up for lost time, but we're doing it less efficiently, it's taking longer, there's more pain and suffering than elsewhere. So this conversation, while we all wish we could be somewhere else, doing something else, we are here today, and it's critically important that we get this right. So with that, I want to introduce Eric Goldwyn to speak. Eric, I'm just going to introduce you quickly. Eric is an assistant professor in the Transportation and Land Use program at NYU Marron Institute, where he leads the Transit Costs project. The Transit Costs project is a stunning piece of work. They have collected data on hundreds, if not thousands of projects, transit projects across the world in order to understand both how much infrastructure costs and why it costs more in some places than others. So for today, Eric is going to speak for about half an hour presenting his work. Then I'm going to spend some time speaking with Eric, and we'll delve in a little bit more and maybe situate some of that work within our own Toronto and Canadian context. And then I'm going to open it up to the audience. I'm sure with this group, you will have lots of questions. So with that, Eric, the floor is yours.
All right, that was very uplifting. Everyone should be somewhere else, apparently. No, I'm kidding. First of all, thanks for having me. This is great. I also, not this afternoon, but recently was rereading a report about what's going on in Canada. And I, too, was struck by how much money Toronto is spending on transit. So anyway, so first, again, thank you for having me. I just want to acknowledge my colleagues, Alon, Elif, and Marco, but there are also lots of other people that helped us collect our data. These are the main people that helped do all the writing. So I just give them a shout out. So I have to give you the talk outline. So the main framing for our research is that spending on transit projects is increasing in the United States. It's increasing here. Are we getting more for that money, or are we getting less? Are we getting the same? It's a thing that's worth knowing. Especially as spending goes up and up. We do find in our research that America does have high transit construction costs. And in order to sort of understand how we could get those costs under control, we wanted to look at places that do things more economically. So we conducted in-depth case studies on a number of projects, a number of cities, to sort of get into what those places are doing well and what we can maybe learn and adopt from them. And our main findings are we could be more efficient. We maybe build things that takes too long, or they're too big, or they're not quite right. They're not optimized, let's say. Transit agencies have limited experience in the US. Many agencies are relatively new, or they haven't built stuff for a very long time. So as an example, in New York, where I'm from, we built a lot of stuff up until 1940. Obviously, it's 2025, so those people are not still involved in building transit. And then there are some expensive decisions that never sort of get questioned. One of the things that we found is that our station costs, for instance, in New York are extremely high, but no one is really there to push back and say, you know what, maybe this could be smaller, maybe we don't need that thing, maybe we should focus on something else. And I think some of that applies here as well. I will hold off on the recommendations a bit, but I'll give you some of them. And then I just want to give a brief update on some of the stuff that has happened as a result of our work. So this is sort of the evidence, right? So the bipartisan infrastructure law is going to makes available about $108 billion at maxed out from the federal government. Now that money requires a local match, so there's going to be local money that is included in that. So it's not just the $108 billion, but it's for us, it's a sizable investment. Just to give a sense of how money is allocated, we have a program called the New Starts program, and agencies apply to get federal funding. And historically, that program has given out $1 billion, $1.5 billion a year to all the different projects in the US, which is not a very big amount of money. But under BIL, under the Biden administration, that number has gone up to about $4 billion per year, right? So we're seeing, a 2.5, 3 times increase in what we're spending. And the other thing I should note about this data is a little bit old. It shows that 47 of the 50 states will be spending more on public transportation going forward. That number, I think, is really 49 of the 50. Both Washington State and New York State have some new projects on the books, so that blue bar should actually be a little bit higher. So then this is our data. We have data, these numbers are maybe a little off right now. 883 rail projects, 57 countries, including Hong Kong and Taiwan, 187 cities. And the big thing that we find is that in the US, we are in the top 10, sort of as Maddie mentioned about Canada. We include some historical costs in there. That's why Canada's costs look lower. But the big thing to take away from here is that in the US, we build the majority of our projects at grade, not in tunnels, which is the most expensive way to build a transit project. And all the countries to the right that are more expensive are building in tunnels. And so I think in the US, it's 37% of our projects are in tunnels, while everything to the right is 65% or higher. A couple things about the data. New Zealand only has one project. This is not totally representative of everything, but we also don't build tons of transit globally. China builds a lot. So it's not necessarily easy to have very good representative data here. But through this data, we were able to show American costs are high, and then we were able to see, okay, well, where are places doing a better job? And so we then took this data to do some case studies on projects. We did a project in Massachusetts on the Green Line extension, phase 1 of the Second Avenue subway in New York, sort of our high-cost countries. And then we looked at Istanbul, Italy, and Sweden as our low-cost examples. And each of those places were picked for a different reason. So Istanbul, outside of China, is probably building the most transit of any city in the world. In Italy, it's a country that saw their costs in the 80s and 90s sort of getting higher and higher, but then they brought them back under control through some federal interventions. And then in Stockholm, it's a very rich country, sort of as the US and Canada are, and they do a lot of tunneling. And so we thought, okay, these are 3 places where we could probably learn a few things. So the primary factors that we identified are actually very similar to some of the things that were identified in Jedwin's report that came out just a few weeks ago. This intergovernmental and third-party agreements, I don't expect anyone to know what that means at the moment, but that's all the stuff you have to do in order to get a permit to shut down a street, remove or relocate a utility. That's what that is. Labor, there is a labor component. Our labor is expensive. It also moves pretty slowly. So a thing worth talking about. Procurement, a topic that I was not so interested in necessarily before all of this, but now I'm kind of, let's talk design build, let's talk about alliance contracting, I'm ready. I think, very interesting. And then the stations piece, especially in underground systems, big stations are expensive. I think for Second Avenue subway in New York, 77% of the hard costs were in our stations. It's a big number. So I'm going to get into the intergovernmental. So there are 2 examples in here that I'll highlight. So the first one is, Duke opts out. There's a project, Go Triangle in North Carolina. It's a light rail. The agency spent $150 million designing, bending over backwards to please Duke. But Duke was very concerned, so they said, that this light rail was going to pass by its hospital, and that this light rail passing by its hospital, there'd be vibration, electromagnetism. It was going to, all their x-ray machines would go kaput, and people on life support would die, maybe being a bit dramatic. The person who was running the project met with the president of Duke University and was like, I will pay for sealing this room so nothing can ever get through, and these machines will be fine, and I will spend all the money to do this. And the people at the hospital were like, well, what if we decide to move the machine? And the point of sort of drawing this out is that every single thing that Go Triangle could do to mitigate their concerns, they would just come up with another concern. And eventually Duke was just like, we're never going to agree to this, and so then you're not going to be able to do this project, and all that money you've spent is fundamentally wasted. And so this is the point of this is that these agencies, they don't have the authority of a governor. They don't have the authority of the mayor. They can't say, to Duke University, you're being unreasonable, stop it. Like, let's go forward. Let's, we're in good faith mitigating this risk, and let's just move forward with our project. The other one that I like to follow is this project in Dallas. It's DART, it's a commuter rail. And what I like about this example, it's depressing in its own special way, is that DART worked out with the city of Dallas an interlocal agreement. So they sort of were like, hey, if we need to shut down a street, this is the process by which we do it. And you're gonna review our designs within 10 days, which is very fast, and then we'll be able to move forward with our permits. Not surprisingly, once sort of the rubber hit the road, Dallas was not issuing those permits in 10 days. And so the CEO of this agency, very uncommon, went to the press and was like, we had an agreement, 10 days. I've tendered a contract to a construction firm, and I can't just, once the contract's tendered, like we have to pay for, they're renting equipment, we have to store stuff, so on and so forth. And she gave this example of a contract that it took 290 days to get the permit. So that's 280 days. And she said it cost $150,000 each day. That's $42 million in delay costs. And she wanted Dallas to sort of pay for it. That probably did not happen. But these are the types of things where, because these agencies don't have any actual power to compel municipalities to do stuff, they are stuck constantly bending over backwards and being pushed around and having things extracted from them. And this gets into sort of the mitigation or betterment. What is that blurry line? What is a mitigation? What is a betterment? If Metrolinx rips up a street, they should absolutely repave it. If they move a utility pipe, they should replace it, of course. But the question is, should they replace to a higher standard? Should they replace to the new thing? So all these pink circles are all the extra stuff that the MTA in New York added on to the street when they were building the Second Avenue subway. They put in floating curbs for a new bike lane. My favorite one is this light is an LED light. In New York, we now have LED lights. We used to have these Cobra headlights, which you can see on the picture without all the burbs, the circles, and they cost about $150 a piece. The LED lights cost $1,500 a piece, right? So you start to see all these ways in which cities are getting improvements, but not paying for them. And again, you should absolutely replace the things that you knock down or rip up, and you should absolutely not build something you shouldn't put something in place that is automatically sort of outmoded, but the city could work with the agency to say, hey, we're gonna do this work while you're doing that work, and let's get going. My favorite example, of course, is about pipes. While they were building phase 1 of the Second Avenue subway, they tendered an advanced utility contract at one of the stations, and as soon as the contract was tendered, the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, the entity that owns the sewer system and the pipes, said, you know what, we know we agreed to this, but we don't agree anymore. And we want you to, give us more expensive pipes, larger in diameter, better materials. And as you can imagine, when something is underground, as you mess with volume, it touches other utilities underground. So then you have to then negotiate with those utilities that you weren't negotiating with. And so this caused a 6-month delay. The head of the MTA's capital construction had to have a meeting with the head of New York City's Department of Environmental Protection to hammer out an agreement. This coordination piece is very sort of underrated and underappreciated. But when you talk to people that work in agencies, they're like, this is the thing that consumes my day. And when I give this talk to professionals, there's always a sigh when we talk about this because they're like, that is really the worst part of my life. So I want to talk about labor with a U. So in 2017, the New York Times wrote an article about the most expensive mile of subway in the world. And they talked about East Side Access, which is now Grand Central Madison, and phase 1 of the Second Avenue subway. And they put forward that the staffing was inefficient. There were too many people, or more people than one needed. But they didn't put it together in a way that at least I could fully appreciate and understand. So when we were doing our work, we found the contractors and we're like, how many people were there? And wages are public for this type of stuff, so we're able to get all the wage data. And so what you see here is it was 46 people per shift, costing $163,000, I guess Oh, okay, that's per shift. So $500,000 a week for the 138 people. And then we asked people in Italy, people in India, people in Turkey, people in France, when you run, or in Spain, when you run your TBM, how many people do you have? And in all those places, we got between 30 and 35 people. That was the number. So I went back to the contractors in New York and I said, let's forget your staffing plan. If you had to do this, what's the minimum? What can you build this tunnel with? And they came up with 30. And I was like, that's pretty good. That's pretty similar to what these other people are telling us. And we had the individual jobs, so then we recalculated how much money could be saved. And as you can see, it's instead of $500,000 a week, it's $350,000 a week to operate the tunnel boring machine. I don't want to belabor the tunnel boring machine piece in particular. It's just a thing that had been a focus in the media and people often talk about in these debates, so we wanted to investigate. So agency capacity. This is the part where the agencies that aren't doing a lot, they rely on outside consultants to help them. And in talking to the consultants, one of the things that was really eye-opening was all of their grievances and complaints about working for these public agencies. It ran the gamut from they don't know what they want, they make us study all this stuff, we're producing a lot of paper, but we're not advancing our projects. And I think what we saw when we talked to entities in Spain or in Italy is that the public sector, they knew what they wanted. They could define their project. They could manage their contractors effectively and say, we want you to do this. We don't want you to do that. Don't study this thing, study that thing. And that clarity of purpose is very important. I mean, you can imagine with anything in life, right? If you know what you're doing, it's much easier to tell someone to do the thing to help you get there rather than maybe not knowing what you're doing and sort of spinning your wheels. So this is sort of one of our examples of the station piece. So in the two-dimensional drawing, in magenta, you have the platform for the Second Avenue subway stations. It's about 610 feet long. And then in the gray outline, you have the station boxes. And so the station boxes are 1,000 feet, 1,300 feet, and 1,600 feet. Now, that probably doesn't mean very much to anyone. But when we looked internationally at sort of in low-cost countries, the overage on the platform length was usually 5%, 10%. So in a 600-foot thing, that's a 660-foot station box. And so we were like, why? Why are these station boxes so big? And the answer was, all of the people that work for New York City Transit, the entity that operates our subways, all of the workers have to have office space, workspace, and eating facilities, bathrooms, all that kind of stuff. And there's all this back of house space that you never see, space that's in your subways as well, is in all of these stations. And so when we asked, well, how do you do it in place X, Y, or Z? And they said, well, oftentimes, instead of having a full mezzanine, we'll use some of that space or we'll build it above the box. But we don't build out and out and out. And the reason why you don't build out and out and out is when you're building underground, the most expensive place to build, you don't want to be wasting money on that. So going forward, New York is looking at sort of other ways of sort of accommodating that space. And then this picture on the right is from the Green Line extension. I don't know if anyone's ever been on the Green Line in Massachusetts, but if you, yes, okay, I see some people have. But if you go on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, it's not even a glorified bus shelter. It is like a decrepit bus shelter. And this station has bike parking. It's 2 levels. It's in a trench. It's not, it has bathrooms, back of house space, all these things. This station, I think, was estimated to be $40 or $50 million. This project essentially got canceled because the budget had increased by $1 billion from $2 billion to $3 billion. And they saved it by sort of saying, hey, we gotta cut our costs. And what they ended up coming up with is this is the redesigned station over there, kind of like a glorified bus shelter, a little bit nicer. But what they did on that project is they cut I think the area of the stations by 91% and saved 71% on the costs. Just in that. They also redid their train yards and a couple other things. And then this picture from our Istanbul case, what is so fascinating about this to me is that they've come up with a different way of conceptualizing sort of the passenger experience in a station. Rather than having one long box for your station, they have two smaller, well, in the case on the left, a smaller box, because Istanbul is a built-up city. Taking property left and right is not anyone's favorite thing to do. And actually, we calculated that on this line, which also moves about, I think it was 180,000 people a day or so, the area for passengers is the same as on 2nd Avenue subway in New York. So even though the station has been shrunk dramatically, they have not sacrificed the passenger space. And all of the back-of-house facilities are above the passenger areas. It's a cut-and-cover box, and so that's how they stacked in all that stuff. So as a result of all this, we found, and usually I have a fancy animation here, but I didn't want anyone to have a seizure on my account. We found that costs in New York and in our high costs are about 8 to 12 times higher than in our low cost places. And we identified the stations add basically double the cost right there. The lack of standardization is another 1.35. Labor 1.5. My favorite labor example from New York is when they built the launch box, so the box to get the tunnel boring machine into the ground. It took them 3 years to build it. And okay, I don't know what that means. That seems maybe reasonable to dig a really large hole. When we asked people in other parts of the world, they said 6 months, a year. So when you take costs, labor costs that are maybe 2 times, 3 times higher, and then add in a time penalty of 6 times or 3 times, you start to understand how these things multiply and costs just go from not 10% more, but to 9% more, 9 times more, 10 times more. And I think that explains a lot of what's going on. So in New York, we're building phase 2 of the 2nd Avenue subway. Our report came out. The timing was amazing. Like the week after our report came out, the MTA was like, our costs have gone up another $700 million. And people were like, that's crazy. And so the MTA was like, we're gonna, not necessarily listen to these people, but we're gonna try to figure something out. And so the first thing they did is they were like, we're gonna cut back on our back of house space in our stations. And so what you see in those white things beyond the green is where they've lopped off sort of the back of house space. So they're not touching the passenger area. And they argue that, not just the back of house stuff, but that's gonna save them over $1 billion. And so I think that is heartening. I'm encouraged that agencies are starting to look at this more. I think while our research is amazing and moves the world, I think it's more that it's so expensive and there's no feasible way to pay for this stuff that agencies, and maybe in Ontario and here in Toronto something similar is happening, they're like, we have to get our arms around this and do better, because otherwise we just won't have transit. And ultimately that's our main thesis, is how do you get more transit per dollar spent? I don't drive, I'm a transit rider, my kids don't drive, they're transit riders. We all need to be able to get to the places we need to go without getting into a car. And transit is the best way to do that. All right, I'm gonna sit down over here.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Eric. I have a ton of questions, as I'm sure many of you do too. So to get us started, can you talk a little bit about why your research focuses on average cost rather than cost overruns? So in this region, you've probably heard me and many others talking about cost overruns and why costs are escalating. Eric's work takes a different tack and is looking at average costs. So I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about the differences and why you've made that choice.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So as you know, a very famous academic, Bent Fluberg, published a number of papers, I guess about 20 years ago now, and he focused on this overrun issue. And I think it was very impactful. But the issue that we have is that while that's an easy thing to measure, right? We know that the budget was this, and then it ended up being that, so we can calculate that pretty easily. What should something cost? Like intrinsically, like what should it cost to build a subway? Much more difficult. And you need to collect a lot more data and things like that. But our argument is that if you focus just on the overruns, the incentives of the public sector is to pad those costs and say, look, our overruns are tiny. But if you're building $1 billion something and it's goes over by 50%, so 1.5 billion, that maybe sounds terrible. But if you're building a $10 billion thing and it goes over, by 20%, so now it's 12 billion, like what's worse or what's better? So I think, our argument is that like, let's start with what maybe things should be. And it's not perfect, certainly. And then sort of go forward rather than trying to minimize the overruns. Let's minimize the absolute costs.
And can you talk a little bit about collecting this data?
Yeah.
What has been the experience? How does one go about getting this level of depth, the station designs, the number of people that work on the tunnel boring machine?
Yeah.
How did you do this? How did you get it so standardized across so many systems, across so many different parts of the world?
So, the sort of the larger data set, we hired, people that speak the appropriate languages. So, I don't know if it's a dozen people, but a lot of people. Like, we have someone who speaks Turkish, Marco speaks Italian and French, and people who speak Chinese, so on and so forth for that data. For the case studies, they just took a long time, and we did a lot of interviews, and we read over as much as we could. And it was really important for us to say, okay, we need to find all of the contracts. We need to find, all of the scopes of the projects, and we need to like meticulously sort of detail all of that. Like if you read our reports, we have these like very detailed timelines often. I don't know that anyone reads them, but they are like as an organizing principle for the researcher, quite helpful because you're kind of like, I really need to find this thing. And so a lot of it is, so our Italian brethren, they have very transparent and just an abundance of information about these projects. And so it was always like, well, how do we do that for New York or for Boston or in Canada, I'm sure someone would tell you, how do you do that for that place? So looking at some of the other parts of the world where you just could get so much information, it sort of led us to say, we need to try to replicate that as best we can.
And are you confident that all the different countries are collecting and factoring in their data in the same way? So for example, you showed the New York case where they're including street lights and whatnot in the transit cost. Is it conceivable that in Italy, they're just putting that on the municipal budget, for example, or someone else is picking up the tab for that?
Yeah, excuse me. So, and I think this goes to the point of why someone focuses on overruns versus other things, is that like, it's messy, it's really hard to do the same thing in every single place. And so we accept that, there is maybe some fuzziness on some of that. But again, it's on the boundaries. The fact that like, here in Canada, they cut scope or cut a project, or same in the States, it means that fundamentally like something is wrong. And I think like that piece of feedback is more important than saying, I have all my carrots here, I have all my apples there, I have all my pears over there. But it's a fair criticism, of course.
Part of my reason for asking that question is because I'm incredulous that when you look at your data, that Barcelona is building their lines for a quarter of the cost per kilometer that we are. Are there qualitative differences in the projects that cost less? Are they getting a worse product?
It's a different product. So one of the big things, so the media in New York picked up on some of this stuff, and the way it was, if you built the Second Avenue subway in Istanbul or in Sweden or in the Italian cities like that, it wouldn't look the way that it looks. Like they wouldn't build the station that big. They wouldn't sort of use some of the construction techniques. Like they would use cheaper things, and it wouldn't have maybe they wouldn't be as voluminous. And I think that like it's hard for people to wrap their minds around that. Like it would be different because it would, like when you spend 10 years building a subway station, it better be really big.
So is there a difference, I guess, in terms of the benefit to transit users? I think of, for example, the Ground Zero station by Calatrava, which, I don't know exactly how it's functioning, but it's this, at least from pictures, it's this stunning piece of architecture. Or the Crossrail in London, which if you've been on it, is just a very different experience. It's a gorgeous piece of architecture. Is there a difference then? Do you get more for that cost, and is there a value to it?
So, I mean, I think the question always is, how many people are we trying to move, right? And, you know, I think the worst interpretation of our research would be, let's just like make everything really small, so that you can't move the number of people you need to move. Like the reason why we distinguish this back of house issue is because that is space that is not for passengers. It's not clear how well used it is by the people that maintain the subway either. And so I think it's like the debate is not on, okay, let's bring the ceilings down lower, let's make it less, make it narrower, and sort of go from moving a station that can, a line that can move 50,000 people an hour to a line that can move 10,000 people an hour. You never want to be going in that direction. You want to, understand the flows that you're building for, and then that's what you hit. So yes, I do think that some of the comparisons, some of the challenge of comparing, say, New York to the Green Line extension in Boston is that like they're just totally different concepts, right? Like in New York, those 3 stations pre-COVID, saw 200,000 people a day. The Green Line extension, I think it's 7 stations, is like 40,000 people a day. Just they're very different beasts, and so I think that's a really important thing to keep front of mind.
Yeah, in fact, I'm reminded in Vancouver when they were building the Canada Line, they cut the length of the platforms in order to save money, thinking that they would never need that much extra room, and if they did, they would get to it later. And later is now. It's not actually that far down the track, and it's turned out it's pretty much too expensive to extend them. So they have a line that doesn't handle the capacity that they need.
And that's like the risk of saying the cost is the most important part. Like it's not. The most important part is how many people you're moving, and then like work from there. Don't say something is expensive, so we're going to build a light rail. Like, if you need to move 50,000 people an hour, you have to move 50,000 people an hour. It's not like you shouldn't negotiate on that.
Yeah. So let's get into this region a little bit. This region has had skyrocketing costs. We've had debates back and forth about what to build. We have a procurement model that is creaking and under a lot of scrutiny. Let's start with actually the question of tunneling. So we are now at a phase, we used to debate a lot about whether lines were going to be on the surface or underground. The current government's view is nothing should interfere with cars, and so everything is going underground. Do you think that, how does that fit with the international experience, and is that a move that fits with what you're finding in your research?
Well, so the thing that's interesting about the lower cost countries is, since they can build things inexpensively, they almost exclusively build things in tunnels. Like they don't do elevated, they don't do at grade. I mean, in some instances, of course they do, but like in the center of a city, they don't. And so we've just think that's very interesting. But like in New York, for instance, like there was a great emphasis on limiting surface disruption. So like even during the construction, they kept traffic flowing on 2nd Avenue. And so like that really slows things down. It adds a lot of cost. And in other places, they're just kind of like, it's going to be disruptive. We're going to shut down this street. We need the space to, as lay down area for construction materials or whatever it is. And that trade-off happens. I think we think we can build a subway in like an unobtrusive way, and I promise you it is very obtrusive even when you are minimizing all those disruptions. So it's the obvious sort of analogy is like, do you rip the Band-Aid off or do you like slowly peel it off? And I think we have gone with the slow peel thinking that it won't be so bad, but it's quite bad.
I feel like we have obtrusive and expensive. I mean, we have one of our main intersections at Queen and Yonge pretty much closed up for 7 years. Right. So this is part of the feeling I've had reading your work, is that we're making all of the mistakes that you've highlighted. And one of the things I liked about your research is that it's very optimistic that you can solve these things. And I wonder how policymakers have responded to your work.
That's a good question. So, at the policy level, there's interest, but it's not a sustained interest. So, an announcement about a project in the Bay Area or in New York or in Seattle or wherever, Atlanta, I should say, comes out and the costs are very high, and all of a sudden people spring to action, are like, how do we address this? But then when you're like, okay, there are like a lot of things one might have to do, it's like, okay, well, I've lost interest. It's a week later. And so like it's the long game. And like I know here in Toronto, one of the things that I think is really interesting, I don't know a ton about it, is Building Transit Fast Act, where they've like shifted master permitting authority from to Metrolinx. And like in the U.S., there's nothing similar to that. Lorem in Montreal had similar at the provincial level laws written that sort of put time limits on how long one could take to approve a permit. I'd love to see stuff like that in the U.S. I think that's very exciting, and we'll see if that bears any fruit here. My understanding is the Ontario line, whatever problems it has moved actually quite a bit faster on getting into construction. Whether or not that yields any savings, I don't know the answer.
I mean, this is what's so interesting about it. The provincial government did pass the Building Transit Faster Act. It does at least visually appear like it's moving faster. It's also costing $2 billion per kilometer. So it's at the upper end. It would be like...
It's a lot.
It would be at the upper end of your data.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about labor. So how does labor compare in terms of the wages? People will often look at this and say, well, we're high-wage countries.
Yeah.
Maybe this is why it's more expensive here. How does labor fit into this?
I mean, labor absolutely fits into it, but the bigger issue is like your production rate. So what I would say, right, if you have a high-cost input, you need to figure out a way to get the most out of it. And if you look at like the building of like the transcontinental railways and things like that, it was always like, is the land expensive or is the labor expensive? And if the land is expensive, you build tunnels and you earthworks and you like try to keep it as straight as possible. You go to the US where the land was very cheap and it's like, going like this because you'd rather take on the labor costs than the land costs. And so, like what I would think is, like going back to that Launchbox example, I was like, well, how do we do this faster, either more automated, whatever it is, like we need to figure that out. I look at, high-speed rail in California, and then you compare it to high-speed rail in construction in China where, like viaducts, all these things are done sort of prefabricated, sort of automated, where here we are hand pouring concrete in the desert. And that's not great.
So why do our project delivery agencies and people responsible for these projects not recognize this themselves and make these changes? Or the contractors? Why have they not looked at the same data that you do? Look at their projects and say, on other projects in other countries or in other jurisdictions, we're using a third the amount of workers to staff the tunnel boring machine. Here, it's more. We could save costs.
Well, the contractors, there's no incentive for them to do that.
Okay.
So like we talked to the ones in New York, and they're just like, we need to do it according to whatever it is. Like our profit is still going to be 5% or whatever it is. So they don't necessarily care about that. Like people talk about sort of labor locking all these things, but like we read over the agreements. So like in New York. There's an agreement between, I'm going to get the Contractors Association basically, and the labor unions. And so like the transit agency is not involved in that, although I'm sure they could get involved if they want to, and the governor could get involved if she wanted to. And it just really, the only thing it says is like, if it's over a certain amount of people, you need to add this person. There's a lot of stuff about drinking coffee and coffee breaks in the work agreement, but it's more that like the norms are, we use this many people. And like, so it is not enshrined, it's not sacrosanct. It could be examined if someone cared. My understanding is, you all care, and in Canada, people care about transit. In the US, it's not like that. These things are an item in the newspaper for a day or two, and then we focus on some other thing. Like the operations is much more of a headline, like the delay or some other thing. People every 2 years, a new estimate comes out about costs, and they're like, oh my God, it's so much money. And then, we keep moving. So I think, we really lack that sort of champion and vision of, what we should be doing in the US. Here it sounds a little bit different.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm looking out at this room at journalists who have made their whole career writing about transit. I mean, we have
that too.
This is something that I think we pay a lot of attention to this, and this is kind of my incredulity at your work, is that we seem to be doing a lot of the things that you're talking about, standardization of stations on the new lines, for example.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the benefits of standardizing stations?
Yeah, so Ben Fluberg, again, he writes about standardization, and what he argues is that it's like a Lego, and I think it's a really nice analogy, and it's well done. But the idea is that, like, if you build a standard thing, you can iterate on that thing and get better at doing it and do it faster and so on and so forth. Whereas if everything is bespoke, you are not able to take learnings from the first thing to the second thing. And so you're never really getting more efficient at it. And so, like, when you look at, if you go to East Asia, I'm thinking in Shanghai, like, all the stations look pretty much the same at the platform level. You wouldn't necessarily know one thing was different. I know in Copenhagen, their city Ringen, the stations, I talked to some of the designers, I think they said it's 70% standardized in their stations. And so, like, you can buy the materials in bulk, you can, all of the escalators and elevators can be bought in bulk. And so, like, there are some economies of scale there. So that's sort of, the theory, is that you can sort of optimize, and buy things in bulk.
Yeah, I mean, so we have two examples. We have the extension of the Spadina subway, where the philosophy was to make every station its own monument,
Right.
Designed by a different famous architect. They are massive cathedrals to transit that are generally half empty and cost a fortune.
Right.
The Eglinton Crosstown, by comparison, they did use standardization. The stations, at least from the outside, look fairly similar, and they have a common design language. That line is now in its 13th or 14th year of construction and nowhere close to opening.
Well, time is a huge part of all this. Like, my number one recommendation when I talk to agencies is just cut the timeline in half. Like, I don't even need to know, but just do that. That's the first thing you need to do. Because, what I was trying to get at with that labor piece, right, is that the way expensive labor interacts with time is it just drives up the costs of things. Like in New York, it took us 10 years of construction to build all of those stations, whereas in other places it could be done in 3 years or 4 years. And so it's not to say that if you build everything really fast, it's always going to be much cheaper, but that tends to be the case.
So how did other places manage the impacts
including Madrid?
So how do they manage the impacts and costs of disruption? Here, every time something is going to be in someone's backyard, there's a new Save Our Something group,
Right.
and then there's sometimes lawsuits, and then in various instances there are mitigations, some of which are more expensive than others, and in other cases the transit agency tries to gut it out and see
Right.
if they can just proceed.
So,
how do other places handle this,
Yeah.
This tension around community impacts of construction?
So my favorite, in our Italian case study, Marco Chidi sort of documented the Italian approach, which I think is really fascinating. So all of the third parties that we were talking about, like the DEPs or the DOT that runs the streets, they all get together. They get the plans. Let's say there are 10 different entities like this, and they get 90 days to say, they get their standard mitigations, by the way. And they said, you have 90 days to all of you agree, and you have to negotiate with each other, not with us, about what it is that you want, right? So, like, if the DOT people want platinum streets, they got to convince the sewer people that that's okay. And so, like, maybe with 2 people you could, through collusion, get to where you need to go. But when you have a lot of people competing there, it makes it more difficult. And the key piece of it is that if at 90 days you have not reached an agreement, the project moves forward, vesting the mitigations that the agency put forward. And I think if you look at sort of the language for LREM, there's some similarities there. Like CDPQ had to give their plan, the phasing, all the stuff. And I think, the equivalent of the DOT, they had 60 days. And if they didn't respond, the project moved forward. And I think operationalizing time is way underrated because you don't want things extending for 13 years, 14 years. And the other thing is the legal systems are different in different places. And so like in Italy, it's like now the law that like this thing is going to be built. And there is not opportunity for NIMBYs necessarily to come in and sue in the same way that there is in some other places.
So in places like Italy or Turkey, do they not complain when someone's drilling at all hours in their backyard? Or
no, people do. People do complain.
How does the transit agency keep the politics together?
No, people do complain. And like, look, there's reasonable. People are reasonable, or you have to be reasonable about some of that stuff. You can't 24 hours a day be blowing up stuff. Like, so my favorite example, so I've done some work in Seattle, and someone I've worked with out there was involved in building a stadium. And there's a prohibition about working after 9 o'clock at night, let's say. And so they said, if we could work 24 hours a day, we would save, I don't know what the number was. And so they went to the city and like, well, what is the issue specifically? And they're like, it's the beeping of the truck when it goes backwards. And so they said, okay, can we hire a flagger, disable the beeping, and just go like this? And they said, try it. And no one complained. And that's what they did. And so it's like, there's lots of little things like that where it's like you think you can't do something, but if you're just like, well, what is the specific problem we need to address in order for you to stop complaining? And now there will be instances where there's nothing you can do, of course. But there are things where like, yeah, that's creative. It's a good idea.
Yeah, totally. What are your views then on mitigations for communities if they're displaced or if there's impacts on their surrounding environment or on retail shops that does add cost to the project but may try to spread some of the pain and gain of these big transit projects?
So, excuse me, the thing that I find baffling is, so I'll use New York as an example. The MTA is a state authority. And I don't expect that to mean much to anyone. But the beneficiaries of the subway are the residents of New York City. The city of New York is the main beneficiary. And so when the city of New York throws up obstacles, it's vexing. It's like, what's going on here? And I think everyone understands public works sometimes are disruptive, and like, someone has to lose in those instances. Again, we can try and we should try to mitigate those disruptions as much as we can, but as you're saying about Young and whatever the intersection was, it's been closed for 7 years. Like, no one is better off as a result of that, and it would be nicer if it was closed for 3 years and they got this thing done. And so I think it's sort of like, yeah, it's hard, but we like made a plan. In some places people vote on that plan. Like we have democratically elected leaders who approve these things. Like that's, not everyone's going to be happy all the time.
I guess a different example, in the northern part of the city, they're apparently digging further, deeper underneath the neighborhood to try to minimize.
I read this.
Yeah,
in the
to
paper.
minimize the vibrations.
Right.
Presumably that has a huge cost.
Yep.
In another neighborhood, they're building a transit maintenance yard, and in order to build that, they had to expropriate an Islamic center, which they're paying $50 million to relocate and rebuild. So how do they, like, some of these are very...
So there's standard laws in the U.S. about these types of things. I assume there are here as well. But sometimes agencies will go above and beyond to avoid a PR sort of thing. Like, so like when our report came out, I know there's been some concern about the report that came out here, but the people that were most sort of up in arms were not the agency, bigwig. Well, I mean, some of them weren't happy, but it was like the media team. They were like, it's going to be perceived as this, and I was just like, when we talked to Marco about what would happen in Italy, they're like, no one cares about the, it's like it doesn't matter if like someone writes an article about the transit agency in Brescia. Like no one is worried about that at that agency, but in the U.S. it's such a concern that the media will be like, unhappy with you or embarrass you in some way.
So a few more questions from me. So start brushing up your questions. I'll come to you in a moment. One is about public-private partnerships. This is a topic that gets a lot of attention in our jurisdiction. We have moved pretty much wholesale in the last wave of transit projects, building through public-private partnerships. What does your research show on their effectiveness?
I think with procurement, there are a couple things. I think first, for those of you that know what design bid build is, that's sort of like the historically, traditionally thing. You procure a design and then you get someone to build it for you. I think we've seen projects have problems, and rather than saying, okay, like what is that problem? It's just thrown out the baby with the bathwater and just try a different procurement style. So I think we could address what's going on there first before trying other things. But in terms of what the research shows, in our Italian case, we looked at multiple procurements, some of which were PPP and other things. And the thing that we found was that the entity managing the program is entity Metropolitana Milanese, which also manages the design bid builds and the design build. They manage everything, and that they are very good at managing these things, and they can manage a PPP very effectively and get a good outcome because, again, they know what they want. They can read a plan. They can say, don't do that, do that. They can direct effectively. I think what you see in the US, and I'm assuming here in Canada as well, is there's this obsession with offloading risk and assuming that you can just sign a contract and now you don't have to do anything. It's like now it's their fault or their problem. And the reality is that it's never the case. With the PPPs in the US, they're very few on the transit side, but none of them take fare box risk. I don't know if you're...
That's the same with you.
And it's like, well, then what are we doing exactly? Like, if they're not taking that risk, which is, like, are people going to use this thing? It's just an availability fee. It doesn't intuitively make that much sense to me as being a good strategy.
So as an alternative, you talk a lot about expertise and capacity within the planning agencies. What does that look like? I mean, here we have Infrastructure Ontario. They're now almost 2 decades old. For a while, they had countries and delegations from around the world coming to look at how they were doing projects, and they were celebrated as one of the more effective transit or procurement agencies. So if that's not working, what does expertise and capacity look like in the places that are successful?
Subject matter experts. So I know there's some skepticism about the Spanish, but when you talk to them about how they manage their projects, they have subject matter experts managing the contract teams, the consultant teams, and directing them and checking on their work. And they have fixed price contracts, fixed time contracts. Things don't just roll on forever and ever. Whereas, in our New York case study, so the MTA in New York City Transit, there used to be an entity called Capital Program Management. It had 1,600 people on staff. They did, I can get the numbers a little bit wrong here, I'm sure, 95% of the construction management and something like 60% of the design work. We got rid of that. We now have something called MTA Construction and Development. I think it has 120 people on staff. When you're managing, and we can use the Toronto example, $80 billion worth of projects, you got to have some people that know what they're doing, sort of managing the public's interest. Like in our Green Line extension case study, it was a $2.25 billion project, the biggest project in the MBTA's history, and I think they had 4 to 6 full-time employees managing it, and then like an army of consultants. With 4 or 6 people, you cannot have subject matter experts in all these different domains managing the different pieces of the project. And so, I've talked to sort of some of the professionals who are just like, oftentimes because there's so many interfaces, you sort of defer to the other person, and you don't question certain things because you don't want them to question, your domain. And so things just sort of like move forward without sort of getting a full and thorough investigation.
So here we have Infrastructure Ontario, we have Metrolinx that has hundreds, if not thousands of staff. They had a project sponsor office, which was specifically responsible for overseeing the project managers. So it's hard to argue here that our problem is a lack of people. We also had all the big Spanish contractors came. they had some pretty rough experiences working with the local contractors.
Right. I think that's actually a really interesting thing is we have the same problem.
Okay.
Where it's like you bring in the Spanish
Yeah.
contractor or the Italian contractor, or the famous one is the French were brought in on California high-speed rail, and they're just like, we got to get out of here. It's too dysfunctional in California. We're going to go to Morocco instead. So the thing is, just because you bring in some of the people that have done it and know what they're doing, if they're not in a system that allows them to execute, it doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, ultimately, the politics, this is very unsatisfying, is so important. And having leaders who, we use the term macro manage, are like, we want to do this thing, we're going to give you the money, we're going to do it, and then you go, experts, do what you experts do. I know, reading some of Jedwin's work and some of the reporting out here that the Ministry of Transportation can sort of intervene at any time and sort of change the scope, cut the scope, add to the scope. In the U.S., there's similar things where we've a vote on something or we agree to a project before we know what it's going to entail, and then now we're stuck having to deliver something even though it's perhaps unconstructable. Or, because really nothing is unconstructable, you just throw a ton of money at it until you're like, okay, this will work. And so I think, some of that, we shortchange some of our planning efforts, which I think is a problem.
We've done that too with Smart Track as one example. Maybe just a last question then. How do you change a culture? Because going down the list of things that you've identified, I think you could make a credible case that we've tried many of those. Perhaps not in whole, perhaps not all together at the right time, but we've tried many of those here, and yet the costs continue to be skyrocketing. So I wonder if ultimately there's something more about the local culture and the politics of the place. How do you change that mentality and that culture to be a lower cost and more effective project delivery jurisdiction?
Well, I'm not either an anthropologist or a psychologist. But again, I think a lot of it, unfortunately, has to do with softer things like leadership and sort of the political environment. And I don't know who's running Metrolinx or who the deputies are and things like that. But I do know that in American agencies, I'll use Seattle as an example where I've done some work. They have one of the largest capital expansion programs in the country. I think it's $65 billion, something like that. And they hired a new head, a CEO of the agency who came from a bus agency in Richmond, Virginia, had never built a light rail. The head of capital construction was a planner, I'm a planner, had never built a light rail. And it's just like, what are we doing? If you want to build a light rail and you're building lots of light rails, hire someone who has done that to lead that process. I don't know the makeup of the people at Metrolinx that are leading all of these things, but my assumption is that there's maybe someone in the CEO position who's more politically minded and is either good at getting money or good at managing up those types of things. And again, there is a need for subject matter experts. You don't need the engineer to be the CEO, but that person needs to be empowered to make hard decisions and go forward.
Okay. Just before we go to audience questions, Eric has referred a few times to Jedwin. Jedwin is Jedwin Mock, who wrote a paper recently with some colleagues, one here at U of T and some others, about transit costs in Toronto and at Metrolinx, which is a really interesting read that got a lot of attention, published by the School of Cities. I would encourage folks to, if you want to kind of see Eric's work transposed to our local context, I'd encourage you to seek out that paper. So we are now at the audience participation part of the event. I see some hands going up, and as we get to that, can I just ask you to introduce yourself and also keep your question to a question, please. I know all of us have strong feelings about this, but if shorter questions will give Eric more time and more time for others to jump in. So first, Richard.
Yeah, Richard Gilbert. Could you say something about building on top of subway stations? It's a very desirable thing both for the transit system and for the developer or the owner, the resident, the office user. And yet almost all our subway stations are single-story buildings. whether they're old ones or in particular new ones along the Eglinton line and the Spadina line that Maddie mentioned. I know in other countries, like in Hong Kong, in Japan, it's quite customary to get the developer to pay for most of the station in return for the higher density. And I wonder if you could just say a few words about funding these very expensive stations through putting buildings on them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of it, of course. I think urbanistically it makes for a better sort of environment. And you use the example of Hong Kong and Japan, where the entity building the trains is also implicated in the real estate piece. I'm assuming here that's not the case. Like if you did an overbuild, it's like no different to Metrolink. Like it's not going to benefit them.
It
or
gets
not.
done separately. Yeah.
It's a separate. Yeah, exactly. That's a better way to put it. So yeah, I mean, I think looking into things like that it's a good idea for sure. It also putting people on top of the transit is, that's the best. Like nothing is better than that. And in New York, we've done for improvements to some of our stations, elevators, escalators. We have done that. We've gotten the building owner to get in there and pay for that stuff.
So can that partially explain higher costs? Just to follow up on Richard's questions, if you have to make the station more, engineering to be able to hold up the building or something?
Absolutely, yeah. Yes.
Okay, next, Brendan.
Brendan, I'm an independent consultant. Clarification question to follow up to Maddie's question about access to data. Two parts. Of all the places you looked at, what percentage were design bid versus P3 consortiums, and how did you get data from the P3 consortiums where, like in Canada, it's totally confidential?
Mm-hmm. So in our large data set, we do not distinguish the procurement method because that would add a layer of challenge that we weren't that interested in taking on. As I said, in the US, P3s for transit, there are very few. Denver has done one. There's one in Maryland right now. The monorail in Las Vegas. I believe those are the main ones. There's still quite a bit of public information, but not at a very disaggregated level. I just want to plug my colleague Marco one more time. One of the things in our Italian case, this is true in our Istanbul case as well, that my colleague Elif led, is that in both those countries they have unit cost price libraries that are public. And so the level of transparency is just dramatically different. Like even in New York and in the US, because we do these lump sum contracts, like you can't get into the nuts and bolts of what those dollars necessarily mean. But when you have these unit cost libraries that are updated by the public sector, like a normal person could just say, okay, you said it's going to be, whatever, this many, tons of steel and this. I can just like start multiplying things and do the algebra myself and get up to what it should cost and say, wait a second, that doesn't look right, or that does look right. And I think what I've heard about the Canadian world, and I'm going to use a word that, and I'm going to say it the way Marco would say it, it's very opaque. It's very opaque here, and I think that's bad. And I think that's bad in the US too, even though I think it is a bit more transparent in certain ways. We don't have visibility into some of that stuff.
Thank you. Tamar.
Hi, Tamar, I'm a postdoc at the School of Cities. Thanks. I wanted to ask, what's the role of planners in planning here? Is planning policy contributing to this, making it better? Or as a planner, are we doing great?
So the big thing is you can wrestle with costs early in the project, right? Before you've just agreed to all the different stuff. So in that Boston example, the thing that sticks out in my mind is that during the public process, people be like, you know what, we should have a unique, iconic station. It should have this, it should have that. And the planner is like, yes, it should have that. But the role of the planner is not just necessarily to say yes, it's to sort of contextualize and talk about the trade-offs. And I think the moment in that project that really sticks out in my mind is there was a public hearing where someone was like, why don't you build the Green Line extension in a tunnel? And so the Green Line extension, just so people know, there's an existing right-of-way with commuter rail, freight rail. It's there. building a tunnel underneath that is just not a good idea. It's going to be expensive. There's just no need to do it. And what I would think, if I were running that process, I'd be like, I get what you're saying. Like, a tunnel's cool, I get it. But like, that would add $3 billion to this project. Or I made that number up. And so like, maybe we shouldn't do that. Instead, what happened, the consultant, I think it was VHB, they spent 9 months studying what it would take to build a tunnel underneath this existing right-of-way. And they said it would cost $3 billion, so I didn't totally make that up. And then another example, I just love these examples. In Seattle, they're building a new maintenance facility, and someone's like, why don't you build it where this dump is? So, because like, you don't have to take anyone's private property, right? So it's like, okay, that's interesting. But you have to then mitigate that. You have to move the dump somewhere else. And it's like, again, it's not a great idea, like, on its face. But the consultant had to go and study it and show the operating costs will be more, the upfront capital costs will be a lot more. Okay, now we've sort of demonstrated that this is not a good idea. I think there's certain things where we just know, like, that's just not a great idea. Let's move forward. We don't have to call anyone a name or anything, but we have to be able to contextualize what these trade-offs mean. And the more expensive something is here, the less we can build. Like in the Green Line extension, they cut a station, for instance, because the cost got out of control. In New York, we broke our Second Avenue subway up into 4 phases because the costs are just absolutely too high. Whereas like, if we had made some different decisions, maybe we could have built phase 1 and phase 2 together, and like, that would be amazing, in my opinion.
Sorry, you might have seen me smiling because I was thinking, maybe like many of you, of the tunnel proposal under the 401. Much of what you're saying is all too real for us here. Yes, you had a question.
Okay,
Yeah, speak up while we get you.
No? I want to say hi to my mom and dad if they're watching.
Hi. Yeah, for the people in the streaming as well. So my name is Dario Gonzalez. You've touched on a bunch of procurement strategies, DBB and P3s. I was wondering what's your take, or if in those projects that you studied, what's your take on progressive contracting? Has it...
Like progressive design build?
Yes.
Something like that?
Has it helped curbing costs down by introducing design elements within the larger construction contract? And the second part of the question would be if alliance type of contracts with pain share and gain share have also introduced the right incentives to keep costs down.
So I think we have to think about, are we building an extension? Are we building something greenfield? What kind of standards does this agency have? So, you build an extension of something, you're locked into a lot of your systems and your networks. You know what you want, fundamentally. So, like, why wouldn't you just do a design bid build? Like, it doesn't totally make a ton of sense to me. Like, you're not really looking for innovation in that instance. In a greenfield thing, I can sort of see it, but it depends on sort of what is the risk tolerance of this agency? Like, do they want to be at the cutting edge of something? I think for public transit, you never want to be at the cutting edge. I think of like the history of BART, and they wanted to have, like space age stuff, and it just didn't work out. Like, you want tried and true and tested technology that you can depend on and is going to work. So my sense with progressive design build has been, design build is not working well, let's try something else, giving more power to the contractors earlier. I'm quite skeptical of that. I mean, my point is, you need subject matter experts at your agency that are doing actually maybe more work defining the scope and defining sort of the role for the project. And again, you shouldn't have a tunnel engineer full-time on your staff. Like, you should get a consultant to do some of that stuff. But managing the construction, like, hire some resident engineers. I've talked to agencies that have problems with delegating authority to to consultants, and I'm always like, either you delegate the authority, which is illegal in most places, or you just hire more resident engineers internally on your staff who can like make informed decisions to keep the project moving forward. And so I think that, again, if you have a competent management team, I don't think the procurement matters very much. I think you can do that. I think things for like systems, like maybe progressive design, build, or allowing for more of that creativity, I think there's room for that, because maybe an agency's not at the cutting edge of those things. But ultimately, like the agencies hold all the risk. Like they got to build this thing, and pretending that someone else holds the risk is, I think we're just fooling ourselves.
Yeah. There's another question over here. Yes.
Yeah, Hamish Wilson. Are you aware of any larger projects? Thank you. Are you aware of any larger projects worldwide that have been scaled back, paused, or knocked a little bit around to squeeze the billions of dollars at all? And in a secondary follow-up would be if there was private sector involvement in the actual planning to really try and squeeze those billions of dollars, maybe that would be a really good involvement of the private sector to, instead of having the taxpayer will pick it up. Any thoughts on that?
Well, so I mean, even the countries that do things well, like they have their problems. They have delays. They have overruns. They have all these things. I don't want to pretend that there's some like transit building nirvana out there. Just better than maybe what we're doing. But what I was going to say, sort of in the U.S., I can think in Seattle, Austin, Atlanta, they get funding through sales tax or other types of taxes. And the strategy there is when you have an overrun, instead of economizing, you just say, let's slow down, collect more of this tax revenue, and that will cover the difference. Now, from an accounting point of view, that's very logical and makes a lot of sense. From every other point of view, that's like the absolute worst thing imaginable. Like when I hear that, it makes me very angry. And I'll be polite about it for the time being. But your question about getting the private sector to squeeze out. So my contention is, I think privatization is good when the private sector has some innovative thing that maybe the public sector doesn't have. Like the example that I always think about is from a book I read, not my own original thoughts, is like the Google search engine, right? Like, who knows how you get to that? Like, let the private sector sort that out. But like building subways is not some secret thing. Like driving buses is not a secret thing. How are you going to squeeze out that savings? I mean, it could be, like that's a thing that the public sector should be able to do. They should be able to be efficient. They there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to do that. And so I do hesitate, because the private sector, they need to make their money. They need to get their rate of return. So I think my point of view as someone who doesn't actually work in construction or at an agency is that the public sector probably can figure that out.
Other questions?
Even though the evidence says otherwise.
Yes. And we have time for one or two more.
My name is Hadi, and the question I have is regarding the recent TTC subway train order for Line 2. So I had a couple questions about the way the city is like procuring the project. So according to the database, I don't know if it's complete yet or not.
It's not.
That you've done.
No.
The new subway trains are the most expensive, like per meter,
Yep.
like in history, like any
Yes.
country, any city. And I was wondering how the TTC like came up with these numbers and how like these estimates are costed out, because it seems that like the TTC came up with the cost and then went to the province, the federal government, the city for money, and then we're essentially now telling Alstom Canada, it's supposedly an open contract, but we're telling them that these trains are going to be built in Thunder Bay, Ontario at the Alstom facility, and this is how much money we have allocated. So how did we come up with that money in the first place? And now there's really no incentive for the bidders to like go below that. So I'm just sort of wondering how these things are like getting costed out.
So obviously I don't work at the TTC. We got the numbers from some TTC documents I'm remembering because that one was the highest one, there was some people were curious. So I know I've looked back over that. There's some TTC document from 2023, I think, that identified the costs. How they came up with that number, I have no idea. But I think the point you're making, absent how they got there, is that, and this goes to the overrun piece, is that if you put massive contingency or you say a price out loud, no one's going to be like, you know what, I'm going to deliver it for half, unless you have like a lot of bidders. But that often is not the case. Right? Like if you set the standard at it's going to be, I don't know, I think it's like $8 million a car or something like that. No one's going to be like, I can do it for 5 if there isn't like a very intense competition. And like rolling stock in particular is not like a very competitive industry. It's like basically a lot of consolidation over the years.
Any other questions? I mean, one of the other pieces of this is how you do the procurement and whether you have Canadian requirements. That's been adding. There was a case in Vancouver when they built the Canada line. They were expecting one manufacturer, a Canadian manufacturer, was going to build the trains. The contractor who got the job ended up using, I think it was a South Korean company, and was saving millions of dollars per train car. So,
and just pocketing the difference?
Well, they put it into the bid, and they were manufacturing them overseas. So there are I guess that's part of this too. There are trade-offs to all of these decisions. Anyone have a last question? Yes.
Hi, James Janowski. Just following on that last point you made about rolling stock, the places that are more efficient, do they have standard? Do they use the standard trains, or do they kind of innovate in a lot of different types of lines, types of like rail width, gauge width, et cetera, or do they kind of use
their national standards? And other, like the U.S., we don't have that for our trains. I believe you don't either. And so you don't just like buy off the shelf, so to speak. I know there's an example of the O line here. Mm-hmm. I know my friend Jonathan has looked at that, where I think they did buy a standard train set, or 3 of them or something like that. And it was very inexpensively done. But what I've heard from rolling stock manufacturers is, agencies want to customize things. And, it's not, well, maybe it is what you would think. It's not what I would have thought. But it's like, you put in your order, and then you're like, you know what, we need these retractable seats instead of sort of, a banquette. And then it's like, they're like, we've already like made the thing, so now we have to like go back. I mean, they're going to charge you for this, of course. Mm-hmm. We have to like go back and like redo it, or like we want the controls on like this side instead of that side. It's like sort of like nitpicky things where clearly the person pushing for that is like not really thinking about the costs in a way that is, or at least in my opinion, it would be a very sensible way of thinking about it. Okay, that brings us to the end of our time. I think we could probably continue to pepper Eric with questions that try to understand why our costs are so high here. Eric, you've done a great job giving us insight from the world that hopefully can inform how we can do things better here. I want to thank you for coming to Toronto. I want to thank you for sharing your insight and expertise with us this afternoon. Let's give Eric a round of applause. I mean, obviously, you should next have Goldwyn come up and do this, because he could explain what's going on here.
Right. So tonight's event was live streamed, so it allowed viewers to tune in remotely from across Canada and the United States. And it was recorded, and you can find that recording on the IMFG website. I want to thank Enid and Shanali again, and wish you all a good evening. Thanks again for coming.